It was just past midnight when the zoo's night guard noticed something strange on the security feed. One of the cameras, camera 7, was glitching, flickering with static. The image slowly cleared, revealing a figure in the distance. He leaned closer to the screen, squinting. There, in the dim light, was a 400-pound silverback gorilla calmly walking along a path, just outside of his enclosure. There was no sign of panic, no frantic movements, just deliberate, measured steps. It was almost as if he knew exactly where he was going. The guard's fingers froze over his keyboard as he realized what he was seeing. The gorilla was not acting like any animal that had ever escaped before. He wasn't causing destruction or looking for a way out. He was leaving, and it seemed like he was on a mission. The guard quickly hit the alarm, alerting the zoo's security team, but by the time anyone arrived at the gorilla's enclosure, he was already gone. The zoo was in chaos. Security teams raced to check the perimeter, trying to track him down. News outlets picked up the story, bewildered by the mystery. "A gorilla has escaped," they reported, but what's truly bizarre is the calmness with which he moved. He wasn't trying to escape. He wasn't acting out of fear. It was as though he was searching for something or someone. And then the question remained. Why? Why would a gorilla, one of the most powerful and intelligent creatures on the planet, risk everything to break free from a secure zoo? What could he possibly want that would drive him to leave his home? Not for food, not for freedom, but for something far more personal, for someone. Why did this gorilla escape? Just to find this girl. The zoo had never seen anything like it. Kumba, the 400-pound silverback, had always been a model of calm, a gentle giant known for his patience with the visitors. But on this particular day, something had changed. For weeks, the zookeepers had noticed that Kumba wasn't quite himself. He had become restless, pacing more than usual, staring out at the zoo's entrance with an intensity that unsettled those around him. He seemed to be waiting for something, or maybe someone. One morning, Emma, a young girl who had been visiting the zoo for years, didn't show up. She had been coming almost every week without fail, always stopping by Kumba's enclosure. The bond between them was undeniable. Emma, a terminally ill child, had formed a connection with Kumba that went beyond the usual visitor-animal interactions. Every time she visited, she would sit quietly by the glass, talking to him, telling him about her day, her favorite stories, her dreams. Kumba would respond in his own way, gently reaching out to the glass, sitting next to her, and even watching her as though he understood every word. For Emma, he wasn't just an animal in a zoo. He was a friend. But this week, she didn't come. Zookeepers noticed it immediately. Kumba's behavior grew more agitated. He would stop pacing for a moment, sit, and then stare at the entrance, as if waiting for Emma's familiar face to appear. When she didn't, he would resume his pacing, each step a little more restless than the last. It was as if he knew something was wrong. Emma had always been a light in Kumba's life, and her absence left a noticeable void in his routine. He wasn't just missing a visitor. He was missing the one person who had touched his heart in a way no one else had. Weeks passed without a word from Emma. The zookeepers continued their routine, but they couldn't ignore the growing sadness in Kumba. His energy seemed drained, and his once calm demeanor had become subdued. He would no longer engage with the visitors like he used to. The playful spark in his eyes had faded, replaced with a quiet longing. It was as though he knew something was missing, something that couldn't be filled by food, toys, or even the attention of the staff. The zookeepers started to grow concerned. They had seen animals mourn the loss of companions before, but Kumba's behavior was different. It wasn't just loneliness. It was something deeper, something more profound. They knew something had to be wrong, but they had no way of understanding what was truly going on in his mind. And then, one day, a letter arrived. Emma's family had written to the zoo, explaining that Emma's condition had worsened. She had been hospitalized and wasn't able to visit anymore. The doctors had said there wasn't much time left. Kumba had never been told of Emma's absence, but he had sensed it. In his own way, he had known. The zoo, though heartbroken, continued to monitor Kumba, but every day his condition worsened. He became withdrawn, spending long hours staring into the distance, occasionally pacing the same path he had walked when he'd first arrived at the zoo. It was as if he was waiting for something, a sign, a chance to be with Emma again, or perhaps a way to make things right. It wasn't until late one evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, that the zookeepers noticed something extraordinary. Kumba, the once apathetic gorilla, had stopped pacing. For the first time in weeks, he was still. But it wasn't a quiet stillness. It was a focused, determined kind of stillness. His eyes were fixed on the entrance to the zoo, his entire body tense. He was watching, waiting, and then, without any warning, he moved. The zookeepers watched in shock as Kumba, with surprising agility for his size, approached the fence of his enclosure. He stood there for a moment, looking at the bars as if considering them, before he began to work at them with his hands. It wasn't like he was trying to escape in a frantic, wild way. It was methodical. He pushed, pulled, and after a few moments of effort, the lock that held the gate shut gave way. The zookeepers hadn't even realized the mechanism was faulty until Kumba had already slipped through. There was no alarm, no panicked dash. Kumba simply stepped out of his enclosure, his steps measured, like a creature with a single mission. No one understood why he'd done it, but there was no question in the zookeepers' minds. He was going somewhere. He had a purpose. And that purpose was far beyond what they could have imagined. He walked through the zoo grounds, avoiding the staff and keeping to the shadows. He wasn't running away. He was heading in a particular direction, with a calm determination. It was as though he had known exactly what he needed to do and was willing to risk everything to do it. As Kumba made his way out of the zoo, the panic set in. Security teams rushed to contain the situation, but Kumba was already well beyond the perimeter. In the quiet of the night, the only sound that could be heard was the rhythmic thumping of Kumba's large feet against the ground. He was leaving the zoo, but not in fear. He wasn't angry. He wasn't escaping from captivity. He was heading somewhere, towards something, or perhaps someone. The question remained, where was he going, and what had driven him to break free? The search for Kumba was frantic, the zoo's security team was mobilized, and local authorities were alerted. Helicopters hovered overhead, scanning the city for any sign of the massive gorilla, while police cars raced through the streets. But despite the chaos, no one could find him. It was as if Kumba had vanished into thin air, disappearing into the city's labyrinth of alleyways and wooded areas. The gorilla moved with surprising stealth for an animal of his size. He avoided main roads, sticking to quieter paths, where the noise of traffic and human activity couldn't disrupt his focus. It wasn't a mindless escape. He wasn't running for freedom in the way a frightened animal would. There was something purposeful in his steps, like he was heading toward a destination he had already mapped out in his mind. The authorities were stumped. No one could figure out where he was going, but there was one clue that kept coming up. Kumba was drawn to the outskirts of the city, closer to the hospital, the same hospital where Emma had been receiving treatment. At first, no one made the connection. It seemed impossible. But as the hours passed and Kumba continued to make his way toward the hospital, something began to feel more certain. Kumba wasn't running away. He was looking for something. Finally, after a long and tense night, someone spotted him. He was outside the children's hospital, standing quietly near the entrance. It was as if he had known where he needed to be all along. His large, dark eyes seemed to scan the windows of the hospital, as if searching for something or someone inside. He wasn't acting aggressively. He wasn't charging or making noise. He simply sat there, waiting. Security arrived quickly, but by the time they reached Kumba, he was calm, still, and utterly focused. He didn't seem afraid of the approaching humans. He didn't resist when they tried to gently coax him back. It was as though he had found exactly what he was looking for. What no one could have predicted, though, was the next moment. Through the window of the hospital, a faint voice could be heard. It was soft, fragile, but unmistakable. "Kumba?" Emma's voice. Kumba's ears perked up and his eyes locked onto the hospital window. Slowly, as though guided by instinct, he made his way closer, and there, behind the glass, he saw her. Emma. Her weak smile was the only light in that sterile room. For a moment, everything else seemed to fade away. The chaos, the confusion, the frantic search. It all stopped. Kumba sat outside, gazing through the glass at the girl he had never forgotten. And in that moment, something extraordinary happened. Something no one could have predicted. As Kumba sat there, outside the hospital window, Emma's fragile smile grew just a little bit brighter. She had been quiet for days, unresponsive to the doctors and nurses who tended to her. But now, as she saw the gorilla sitting there, so close yet so far, something seemed to stir inside her. Her hand weakly reached out towards the glass, and she whispered his name. Kumba. The doctors and nurses were stunned. They had seen Emma in a deep sleep for what felt like days, barely able to speak or move. But now, she was looking at the gorilla with a clarity that they hadn't seen in a long time. She wasn't just seeing him as an animal, she was seeing her friend. Kumba, too, seemed to recognize the change. He leaned closer to the glass, his large face filled with a deep, silent understanding. For a few moments, they simply stared at each other, both separated by the glass, but united in a way that transcended words or barriers. There was a bond between them, unspoken but undeniable. It wasn't just a chance encounter. Kumba had come for her. And in return, Emma had found the strength to speak his name, something she hadn't done in days. It was like a lifeline had been thrown between them, a connection that neither time nor distance could sever. The hospital staff remained at a distance, unsure of what to do. But the moment felt sacred. The gorilla, so large and powerful, sat quietly, his presence oddly calming. Emma's parents, standing by the bed, could hardly believe their eyes. They had never seen their daughter so alert, so alive, even if just for a brief moment. Kumba stayed by the window for hours. He didn't try to break in or make any demands. He simply sat there, offering his silent company. The hospital staff, unsure of how to handle the situation, eventually allowed the moment to unfold, giving Kumba the space he seemed to need. By the time the sun began to rise, Kumba had finally moved away. He walked calmly back to the edge of the hospital grounds, where animal control had set up a perimeter. But he wasn't in any rush. He had found Emma, and in that moment, they had shared something no one else could understand. Emma, too, had found something that none of the doctors or medicine could offer her. Peace. The connection she shared with Kumba was unlike anything else, and it had given her something she needed more than anything else. Hope. The doctors couldn't explain it, but her condition had stabilized after that night. It was as if something within her had changed, something sparked by the silent strength and presence of the gorilla who had come to find her. The days following Kumba's visit to the hospital were nothing short of miraculous. Emma's health, which had been declining rapidly, seemed to stabilize. It wasn't an immediate recovery, but there was a noticeable shift. She was more alert, more engaged. Her doctors couldn't explain it. No treatments had changed, no new medications had been introduced. But Emma, the little girl who had been teetering on the edge, seemed to be holding on, stronger than before. Kumba, meanwhile, had been returned to the zoo. After that unforgettable night, he was gently coaxed back into his enclosure, where zoo officials tried to make sense of what had happened. The security footage was examined, and the timeline was pieced together. It was clear that Kumba had left with a singular purpose, to find Emma. But no one could quite understand how or why he knew. The zoo staff noticed something different about Kumba after the incident. The usual restlessness that had plagued him for weeks was gone. He was calmer, more serene. The spark in his eyes had returned, and he seemed content, as if a deep yearning had been fulfilled. He no longer paced the perimeter of his enclosure, waiting for something that wouldn't come. Instead, he was at peace. A few months later, Emma was able to visit the zoo again. This time, the visit wasn't about searching for a familiar face through the glass. Instead, she was able to walk, though with the help of her parents, to Kumba's enclosure. When she arrived, Kumba was there, waiting. As she approached, he walked slowly toward her, his large hand resting gently against the glass, just as it had done so many times before. The moment felt full circle. Emma smiled, her face brighter than it had been in a long time, and she pressed her palm against the glass, right where Kumba's hand was. They locked eyes, and for a brief moment, the world around them seemed to disappear. There was no need for words, no need for anything more than the quiet understanding between them. Emma had found her strength again. Kumba had found his peace. They had both found what they needed in each other. And in doing so, they had given each other a gift neither could explain. The zoo eventually put up a plaque near Kumba's enclosure, honoring the bond between the gorilla and the little girl who had been more than a visitor to him. The plaque read, "Dedicated to the unspoken bond between a girl and a gorilla who never gave up on each other." Emma, although her journey had been difficult, had lived longer than anyone had expected. And Kumba, forever changed by their connection, continued to live out his days at the zoo with a quiet serenity. Though their time together had been short, the impact they had on each other's lives was undeniable, a bond that neither time nor distance could erase. The story of Kumba and Emma spread far and wide, touching the hearts of people all over the world. It was a reminder that love and connection can exist in the most unexpected places, and sometimes it takes a special bond between two very different beings to show us the true power of friendship, hope, and the will to carry on. As the years went by, the story of Kumba and Emma continued to inspire people around the world. It became more than just a tale of an unusual bond between a gorilla and a little girl. It became a symbol of hope. People who had heard the story began to visit the zoo, not just to see Kumba, but to witness the magic that had unfolded between him and Emma. The zoo, once just a place of exhibits and wildlife, transformed into a sanctuary for stories of connection and healing. Emma's story, too, lived on. The plaque near Kumba's enclosure became a place of pilgrimage for those who had followed her journey. Visitors would stop and read the words, and many would pause in quiet reflection, moved by the incredible tale of a bond that defied all odds. It reminded them of the power of love, even in its most silent and unspoken form. The zoo staff, who had been there when it all happened, still couldn't explain how Kumba had known to find Emma. They had no scientific explanation for how the gorilla, an animal whose intelligence was often underestimated, had been drawn to her in her moment of need. But they didn't need to explain it. The connection was real, and in the end, that was all that mattered. Emma, though no longer with them, remained a part of the zoo's legacy. Her family, who had once been in mourning, found solace in knowing that Emma's story had brought so much light to others. The gorilla, Kumba, had given their daughter a final gift, a moment of peace, of joy, and of comfort when she needed it most. And in return, Emma had given Kumba something he had never known before, the strength to keep going, to keep living, to keep hoping. Kumba, too, had a lasting impact. His calmness and wisdom became a symbol for the zoo's mission to foster deeper connections between humans and animals. Visitors often spoke of the way Kumba would look at them, his eyes filled with an intelligence that went beyond the physical. He had become a teacher, a guide, not just for those who visited, but for the zoo staff as well. The bond with Emma had changed him, and they all saw it. As time passed, Kumba grew older, but his presence remained as powerful as ever. And when the time came for him to move on, it wasn't with sadness. Instead, there was a quiet sense of gratitude, as if Kumba had fulfilled his purpose, both for Emma and for everyone who had been touched by their story. The legend of Kumba and Emma lived on, carried in the hearts of all who had experienced it, a reminder that sometimes the most unexpected connections can change the world in ways we never imagined. It wasn't just a story about a gorilla and a little girl. It was a testament to the healing power of love, friendship, and the extraordinary bond that can form between two souls, no matter how different they may seem.